Well, good Monday morning to you, and welcome to our Monday morning live edition of the Doctor's Nutrition Show. I am your host, Jim Tabor, along with Doctors Jim and Janine Fox of Doctor's Nutrition, located on Cal and Lorraine Road in Gulfport, just south of Pass Road. If you're first tuning in, this is a live show. We take calls about, whatever our subject is, and of course, if you have any other questions regarding your health, well, that's what the show is all about, helping you live a healthier lifestyle. Our phone numbers are on the screen, 896-0713 or 800-349-0713. Those are the numbers that you can call, pass your question along to our producer, and they will pass it along to us. Well, February is Heart Awareness Month, and millions of Americans have cardiovascular risk, and they're not even aware of it. So this morning, we're going to be talking about how you can assess and reduce your cardiovascular risk.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, because heart disease is still the #1 reason for death.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the leading cause. It and cancer is #2, but leading cause.
And it's not just in men.
No.
That's one of the things they say is a big myth, is people think it's way more in men than women, and that's not true. We see a lot of women that have had cardiovascular problems and had blockages and had no idea they had it, wasn't even at risk, didn't have,
Right.
or didn't think they were at risk, I should
Right.
say.
They
were at risk, they just didn't know it because they weren't overweight. You know, you see people that they think, okay, I'm not overweight, I exercise, I'm okay. Well, that's not necessarily true. Genetics play a huge role in cardiovascular risk, and we're going to talk today about the testing that can be done, and even advanced testing that can be done to actually look truly at what your risk is.
So how do you assess your cardiovascular risk?
Blood work is one of the better ways of doing it.
That's a starting point.
It's a starting point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people come in, we hear this every day. Oh, well, I've already went through a whole thing. I had stress test, echo, all that, and it's normal. Well, yeah, does not necessarily tell you the risk. That tells you if you already have a problem. Okay,
Right.
That's different. Now, if you already have a problem, that's a problem. But you want to know, do you have the risk factors that lead to? You want to catch it before you have a blockage or before you have a heart attack or a stroke. You don't want to wait until it happens. So the stuff that we're talking about is looking at, even if you've had clear stress tests, if you've had a clear echo, you can still have the underlying risk that is coming.
Right. And that's the problem with, for instance, just like a stress test. So unfortunately, a stress test cannot determine every risk that you have, unfortunately. It's quite common for people to have a stress test and then very shortly afterwards have a heart attack. And so, same thing. Now, the echo is good because it'll tell you if everything's working correctly, if your valves are working correctly.
More valves and things
the
like
heart
that.
muscles doing what it's supposed to do and so on. Great test.
It is a great test because you cannot tell what it tells you on an echo in lab work.
Right.
You can't tell if your valves are bad or they're
Right.
leaking or anything like that. So it is a great
And your
test.
cholesterol has something to do with that as well.
Well,
it can
Well, we're going to get into,
contribute.
okay, let's get into cholesterol because cholesterol alone is not a problem.
Well,
Well,
alone, no.
No.
But
Well,
it can contribute.
Well, it can. It's one of the factors.
Not just high cholesterol
No.
is always bad.
It can actually be low and cause problems.
Yep.
Really?
Because, 50% of the people that have a heart attack have normal cholesterol.
Yep.
Okay, so think about that for a second.
Huh.
Now, if that's the way the thing crumbles, then why are we so focused on cholesterol, for God's sakes? Because, what we have to do is we have to look into that cholesterol, because looking at your LDL cholesterol, which is what they always focus on, looking at LDL cholesterol and calling it cholesterol really is kind of a misnomer, because it's not just cholesterol. It's a low-density lipoprotein. And in that lipoprotein, you have other fats, triglycerides, fatty things that we need for like cell membranes, all that is in that LDL molecule, and we call it a particle. So there's a test that we do, and we've probably done more of them here on the coast than anybody because we do it constantly, and it's called an NMR. What it does is it breaks down that cholesterol, looks at that LDL fraction and HDL fraction for that matter, and your triglycerides, et cetera, and it looks at how many particles does it take to move that cholesterol around your body. That's the most important part. Because I'm sure probably some of you may have read, somewhere where said, well, you need to have your ApoA checked or ApoB. And okay, yeah, I think you really do. The particles carry an ApoB. Now, when you look at the NMR, you look at the total number of particles. Each particle has an ApoB. It also gives you the Small particles, okay, the big particles, big fluffy ones are not problematic. The small ones are, and there's a different APO on each one. The APOB 100 on the big particles and APOB 48 on the small particles. So you get to look at that, and then you look at your HDL, because HDL, oh, if you got really good HDLs, you're great, you're you're healthy. Not necessarily. I don't know the percentage, because we see a lot. Folks that come in that have a really good looking HDL, if you just look at the gross number, but when you look at the HDL particles, remember that's how that cholesterol is moving around the body, and that HDL particle may be very low, and if it is, you have what we call a dysfunctional HDL.
Right, and dysfunctional HDL, there's getting to be more and more research out there about it. So cholesterol alone, you can have high cholesterol and still have normal particles. But you can have normal cholesterol and have very high particles. So you can't just say that that one factor is what you look at. And you have to have cholesterol. Cholesterol serves a big part in the body and in the brain. So it's not just lowering the cholesterol to rock bottom is going to keep you from having cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of other factors, and that's what we're going to talk about too. Now, still while on cholesterol, there is also something called oxidized LDL.
Right.
And in a lot of the cadaver studies where they've done tests on, the plaque in the arteries and everything, they usually find that the cholesterol in that plaque is oxidized. So if you have oxidized cholesterol, way worse. I don't care what the number is, you've got to get that oxidation down.
Yeah, and oxidized LDL is very sticky. So, and our cholesterol is constantly going in and out of our endothelial lining of the arteries and so on. And it's going in, doing its job, delivering things like triglycerides to the cells, blah, 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 back out. And if it's oxidized, it has a free electron. And remember, back to biochemistry, which I know it's a little too deep, but anyhow, the biochemistry tells us that if we have a free electron, then that molecule is looking for something to steal an electron from to make it whole again. And when it does, it's very sticky. So it tends to go in, get stuck, now we got a problem. And then here comes more in behind it. And so it's the oxidized LDL that really is, and just because you're in range in oxidized LDL, really does not save your grace.
Yeah, you want it to be on the very, very low
very
end.
Bottom end of it, yeah.
And you don't want a lot of oxidation. And if you have a lot of oxidized LDL, it tells you probably have a lot of oxidative stress in your body as a whole, which is just not good for overall health. Oxidation is even a cancer risk. So there's a lot that goes into it, not just the total cholesterol.
Right.
All right. 896-0713 or 800-349-0713, where it is Heart Awareness Month, talking about cardiovascular risk this morning. 8 minutes after 9 o'clock, we'll take a break and we'll be right back. And welcome back. 10 minutes after 9 o'clock here on this very chilly Monday morning. And we're talking about Heart Awareness Month and how to reduce your cardiovascular risk.
Yes.
Right.
One more thing about lipids that I didn't mention yet is one of the big risk factors in cardiovascular health is if you're insulin resistant.
Yes.
Now on the NMR, it'll also give you an insulin resistant score, which tells you how insulin resistant you are. Now if you have high triglycerides on your regular lipid panel, I guarantee you're insulin resistant.
It's one of the first signs.
Right, and how much we'll see. But high triglycerides are at extreme cardiac risk. And they know that prediabetes, diabetes, that all increases cardiac risk as well. So that's why insulin resistance is a precursor to prediabetes and diabetes, and is a huge cardiac risk in itself. So just wanted to mention that because triglycerides are huge.
Actually, one of the biggest risk factors that you can take away, even from your standard lipid panel that they might do at your doctor's office. Take your triglycerides and have your HDL. Now divide your HDL into that triglyceride. So if your triglycerides are say 120, which they're going to tell you, oh, they're fine. If you take that 120 and you take your HDL, say 35, divide that into it, not such a good ratio.
Right.
You want about a 3 or less ratio.
Now if you have a triglyceride at 80 and your HDLs are 80, you're good.
You're good.
So it's really more about ratios, and that ratio is never calculated out for you.
Yeah.
So we always look at things like that when you're looking at the NMR and the lipid panel, so you can see where's your risk factors.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what other indicators are there?
There's a lot of other
cardiovascular risk.
Now, we talked about the cholesterol and we talked about the oxidized. We also, there's something called a HSCRP, which is a test that looks at the inflammatory response in the body. Now, you know, and you'll see where they say, well, it's not just for cardiovascular, and that is true. You have to look at if there's an extreme inflammatory response going on in the body, like some sort of autoimmune disease, an RA or something, you know, even gout, stuff like that, it's going to falsely elevated. But if everything else looks good, but yet that CRP is elevated, then you know that that's probably an inflammatory process in the arteries. And so you know if there's inflammation going on, inflammation goes along with starting plaque.
Right.
So
yeah,
that's another thing that if that's high, you definitely want to get it down.
One of the big factors, and this is something that we do on one of our panels that we'll be talking about here, is the homocysteine. Now, homocysteine is an amino acid of sorts that it's a byproduct of living and breathing. So we all make it. The problem is it has to be quenched or changed into something that's inert, because in the state as homocysteine, it's highly oxidative, highly reactive, and when it bumps into something, it's going to hurt. So inside those arteries it's floating around in, it's going to actually do some damage to those arteries.
All right, we have a question. When visiting a doctor, do I need to ask for extra blood tests for oxidation and particles in the blood, or is it included?
Sure.
You
no,
can,
they're
you
never
can ask.
included.
We don't see a lot of it done around here, and we don't see it done around the country much.
Not a lot.
And a lot of reasons is sometimes insurance don't want to pay for it. We do it, and we have a panel that we have everything in one for the cardiovascular risk, but you can ask your doctor to do it, because we don't deal with insurance, and we don't deal with insurance specifically because they don't like to pay for the extra testing.
Right.
So we do it as inexpensive as we can, and it gives you a lot more information.
Right.
And I've even seen before where, like homocysteine, an insurance company didn't pay for it unless you already had a heart attack. And it's kind of like, okay, that's a little late. So you don't want to wait until something happens to have it. We like prevention, doing things ahead of time to know, to prevent things from happening.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of times with some of these testing, they won't do it unless you've already had a problem.
And the thing about some of these risk factors, we might be talking about 10, 15, 20, even 30 years that it takes to manifest into something really bad. So if you start early enough, you can catch it before it becomes something really bad. That's the problem. You don't want to wait till you're, I always say, you don't want to wait till you're in an emergency room with an IV in both arms. That's not the good time to start trying to change things.
Now we are seeing things younger and younger. Now one thing we see that we've always seen young is homocysteine.
Yes.
It is more of about your 100% genetics and genetic mutations. And if you have certain genetic mutations that doesn't let you have if you don't have the enzyme to convert homocysteine into methionine, or you don't have the enzyme, I should say, to convert folic acid into folate.
Right.
Then you can't lower homocysteine. So we see that in 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds.
Yeah, because we see 16, 17-year-olds that have low folate and they have low B12. That right there. Now that's something that, like, okay, you could survive, no problem. You probably won't have any symptoms for, say, 20 years or more. But when you do, it's going to be a big one.
It's going to, yes. So
that's the problem.
It's not just in the people as they age. You can find out some of these risk factors when you're younger.
Yes.
And right now, the scary thing on cardiac risk and cardiac disease, I should say, the age group that has the biggest increase in heart attacks is, I think, from 20-something to 40.
Yeah.
And that's scary. And there's been a huge increase. Every age has had a huge increase since COVID. But that age group has the biggest increase. Not the biggest amount, but the biggest increase.
Can low folate contribute to possibility of stroke?
Well,
possible.
Yes, because it can actually increase homocysteine, and homocysteine increases all your risk factors.
Yeah,
all your cardiovascular
When we talk about
risks.
cardiovascular risk, we're talking about heart attack and stroke.
Heart attack and stroke.
Right, right. Okay.
Yeah, both sides.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into looking at risk. And another thing, we've talked about it multiple times on the test, is an omega check.
Yes.
There's been a lot of research done where they look at if you don't have enough omega-3s when compared to your omega-6s, then you are at an increased risk for cardiac as well. It also increases dementia risk.
I was going to say, that tends to get more people's attention than cardiovascular risk.
Well, actually, though, what's good for the heart is good for the brain.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. So actually, these cardiac tests also give you ideas about brain, because high homocysteine, dementia is one of the big risks. So a lot of these things go hand in hand. Yeah.
Okay. How do you tell if lab work on homocysteines are good or bad?
Well, you go by the level.
Yeah, and it should be, honestly, the range goes, you could drive a Mack truck through it. I mean, it's that big. But what you want to do is look at the lab reference range and forget about that for just a moment. You want your homocysteine to be 8 or less.
Right, and there's been whole books written on just homocysteine. The whole book is on it. And they usually, the people that get really deep into the research on homocysteine say you want it below 8.
Yeah.
Some out there even say 6, but
that's
I think 8's probably a better range because a lot of people's are below 8. There's not many below 6.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To where the range goes up to 14 if you're young, and on our lab it goes up to like 20 something if you get older, which I don't think you should have higher levels because you're older.
Right.
It just increases your risk more.
Right.
All right. 896-0713 or 800-349-0713. We're going to have our final break here in just a couple of moments, our final segment, and have this week's special. It's 18 minutes after 9 o'clock. And welcome back. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, we're talking about assessing and reducing your cardiovascular risks as this is Heart Awareness Month. Let's go ahead and look at what the special for this week is.
Actually, it's our Super Cardiac Panel, which it is a panel and is different than our expanded cardiac panel. The Super Cardiac Panel is normally $395, and this week it's $35 off. Now, it is going to have all the tests that we've talked about today on it, plus much more. Yeah. It actually has your NMR, which has all the particles and insulin resistance score and all that. It has your homocysteine, your CRP, your oxidized LDL. It does the omega check to look to see how your omega-3 to omega-6 is. But it also has everything else for overall health. So it does check your thyroid, your adrenals. It checks your vitamin D and B12 and folate and magnesium. And it does an A1C and your insulin, which is all cardiac risks, because diabetes is a huge cardiac risk. Everything on our weight loss panel is also on that, because weight gain is a huge cardiac risk. So anything that actually tends to increase cardiac risk is on that panel. So it is a big panel. It checks a lot of things. So it does a lot of extras. So it is a little expensive, but for what it has in it, it's actually a very good price.
Yeah, if you went somewhere like Cleveland Clinic or somewhere like that, one of the big heart labs, that's the kind of testing they're going to be doing on you. And if your insurance didn't want to pay for it, it's going to be in the thousands.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's actually a really good test to really assess your risk.
Right.
And so it is something that we definitely recommend. We've been doing a lot more of them, and we've seen a lot of things that definitely show that the person is at risk.
Right.
Well, this is the time of the year that it's time for me to have my blood work.
Yep.
So
and you're going to do that.
I'm going to do that this week,
yeah.
so we can talk about that in the next week or so, and see exactly how I get evaluated.
Now that test does take a little time to come back because of the specialty test on it. So it is not an instant that it comes back. It might even take a couple weeks to come back, just to let everybody know.
Right.
And it is a fasting test, so you do have to fast 12 hours before you have it done.
Yeah, the omega check can take up to a week and a half to maybe possibly even close to 2 weeks.
So no snacks after 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah, right.
No snacks.
Some of these tests aren't even done by LabCorp, which is who we do our lab work with. They actually have to send them to specialty labs.
Right.
And so they actually, because they're not everyday tests.
Right.
And that's what you want to do, and it's just not done routinely, and it's mostly because of insurance don't want to pay for it.
And I think all too often we've seen this. If you go to you have your routine stuff done, just your routine stuff, and the patient comes in and says, "Well, I'm okay. They told me I'm fine because I've had this, and this done, and it's all the routine stuff." And I think it gives you a false sense of security, because you think, "Oh, okay, I'm fine," and so you continue doing things that may be just on a little bit the bad side, that it's going to cause you problems down the road. It takes a long time to do it, but again, you're still doing something that really you shouldn't be doing. That's kind of the key. And if you don't know something's wrong, you don't know to correct it. That's the big number right there.
So what kind of lifestyle changes do we need to make to reduce our cardiovascular risk?
Of course, diet is always number one, because we mentioned insulin resistance being a huge factor. And I think you saw a statistic in one of the books you're reading that says 88% of all Americans are insulin resistant.
Yeah. 88%.
Wow.
Yeah,
When you really look at it, I mean, that's
and
high.
we're seeing that in young, I'm talking about young.
We've seen 10-year-olds that are pre-diabetic now.
Right.
So we're seeing it younger and younger and younger. And so it is something that you've got to find out early so that you can do things to change it.
Yeah, so back to the lifestyle thing.
Lifestyle, yeah.
Okay. Packaged processed food happens to be the worst possible thing that you can do for your cardiovascular health.
I think we hit on that almost every week.
I think we talk about that every week, and it's a fact. You know, when you look at, and it's not just the sugar that they put in there, but they do put a lot of sugar in there. They put a lot of other stuff in there too, that's just not good for you.
Sodium.
Well, it's not just sodium. You got to have sodium to live.
Yeah,
you know,
but someone put so much sodium in there.
Well, yeah, they load it with everything because they got to make it taste good.
Yeah,
and a lot of times
cardboard
the
don't taste good
actual
otherwise.
nutrients have been removed from a lot of this packaged processed food.
Right.
That's where they get the nutrients that you sell in bottles is from the food that they're packaging and processing.
So
think about that.
Pot pies used to be my weakness.
Yeah. Make them homemade.
Well, this is true.
Make them homemade. You can do a pot pie homemade.
But you know, real food is what we want to do. We want to try to avoid sugar. I mean, obviously that's a number one thing. But what most people don't realize is when they try to avoid sugar, they still eat a lot of fruit. Okay, sweet fruit is loaded with fructose. Fructose is way worse than glucose, because when you look at your actual sugar, table sugar, the white stuff that you put in your coffee or whatever, all right, 50% of it is fructose, 50% of it is glucose. Now, our body works fine with glucose. It just doesn't have a very good method of handling that fructose. Fructose is the bad guy, and it's in everything. And fructose is a lot sweeter. You've seen the high fructose corn syrup, for instance. Now they've even got one that's like up to 90% fructose. So, you know, you just have to stay away.
And you got to get off of the bad fats. Soybean oil is one of the worst oils that you can do. And they know that it increases something called foam cells, and foam cells increase plaque. But start looking at your packaged processed food. Start looking at the mayonnaise you buy in the grocery store. I don't care if it says olive oil on the front, you turn it around, it's got soybean oil in it. So you got soybean oil in everything that's packed, most of the things that's packaged and processed. So you got to start getting away from the bad fat as well.
Right, and that's one of the keys. You know, so the worst fats you can possibly cook with is going to be something like corn oil,
canola
oil.
Yep.
Because those are what they call PUFAs, or the polyunsaturated fatty acids. The bad thing about PUFAs, they oxidize rapidly. They're just not very stable. I mean, because they'll stay, and that's why they go rancid. If you've got some oil that you've had in your cabinet for a while, and you open it and say, ooh, doesn't smell good, it's rancid. And that's where they say, oh, get rid of that. Well, yeah, get rid of it because it's loaded now with trans fats. And trans fats are not really good. There's a lot of research on trans fats. So you want to use good fats. Now, olive oil is a good fat. Actually, your animal fats, if it's an organically raised animal, is okay, because there's saturated fats, and those saturated fats are fairly stable. They don't oxidize very fast, so you can get by with that. But nuts, your walnuts, cashews,
nuts are good.
And that is my snack during
at
night before I've got some thing of mixed nuts.
So there's so many things. We could probably do a 2-hour show on cardiovascular risk because there's so much that goes into it.
Oh, yes.
But the big thing is if you do the lab work, you can see where your risk factors lie. If your family history is huge, you know that you're probably at risk from that, and you want to see what you can do to lower it.
Right.
Yeah. Exercise.
Exercise.
Quit smoking.
Oh, definitely quit smoking.
Cut back on your alcohol.
Yep. Over drinking. Not exercising and smoking. Not good.
Nope.
And weight gain. Not good to be overweight.
Exactly. Anyway, next week we're talking about
common skin problems.
Okay.
So we'll talk about different things in the skin.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to go on their YouTube channel now and subscribe to that. You can find a lot of information there, and the podcast and everything else. So we will see you next Monday morning here on the Doctor's Nutrition Show. Have a wonderful week.
For more information on highlighting your business and services on Healthy Living South Mississippi, contact Jim Tabor at 896-1313.